I pulled into my driveway after a long trip, expecting nothing more than the quiet welcome of home. But instead, a glaring note was taped to my door. "Cops will be called if you return." My heart skipped a beat. How could anyone know I was back? And why would my own HOA target me like this? I stepped closer, trying to make sense of the absurdity, only to realize something chilling. They had no idea who they were messing with. What I was about to do next would shock everyone in the neighborhood. But would it be enough to stop them? I had always loved the quiet rhythm of my little ranch community. Wide streets lined with oak trees, neighbors who waved as they passed by, and a sense of space that made every evening feel peaceful. My mornings began with coffee on the porch, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting from the yards next door. Life here was simple, predictable, and comfortable, exactly what I had been looking for when I moved in. I wasn't flashy. My house wasn't the biggest, and my landscaping wasn't immaculate. I mowed the lawn, trimmed the hedges, and waved hello to the neighbors, expecting nothing more than the same small courtesies in return. Yet beneath the calm surface, the HOA kept a meticulous eye on every property, every fence line, every violation that could be imagined. It wasn't unusual for a note to show up on someone's door about a rule nobody remembered reading. Most people shrugged it off, an annoying part of living under HOA oversight. I had done the same, assuming the petty rules wouldn't touch me. But in this neighborhood, sometimes even the quietest residents could draw attention, especially if they unknowingly stepped into the invisible hierarchy the HOA had built. And that's exactly what I was about to do. I didn't know it yet, but my return from a brief trip would ignite a chain of petty accusations, threats, and absurd demands, all from people who had no idea I wasn't just any homeowner. When I opened the next day, a crisp white envelope lay on my porch. The HOA had left it, stamped with their seal, as if the formal touch would make the absurd claim inside feel real. They accused me of unauthorized exterior changes, a paint color that had been approved when I first moved in, a fence that had existed for a decade, a mailbox post that had never drawn attention before. My heart sank, a strange mixture of disbelief and rising anger washing over me. I double-checked every detail. Nothing had changed since I left, yet suddenly I was the offender. Calls followed, emails, passive-aggressive notices slipped under my door. Every day a new violation appeared, each more trivial than the last. My neighbor's dog barked incessantly at my yard, prompting another complaint about disturbing the peace. I tried to reason, explaining the dog wasn't mine and that the barking was brief, but the HOA board refused to listen. Each response I received was bureaucratic, cold, and condescending, dripping with authority as if I were a criminal in a courtroom. The tension escalated when a mandatory compliance meeting was scheduled at the community center. I attended, expecting a brief conversation, maybe a warning. Instead, I was met with glare-filled faces, the air thick with judgment. The chairwoman, a woman whose power trip was obvious in every syllable, listed my alleged offenses in rapid succession. Paint color, she started, then fence height, then landscape maintenance schedule. Each accusation was more absurd than the last, and each came with a threat of escalating fines. My stomach twisted. These weren't suggestions, they were rules wielded like weapons. I returned home that evening, my mind racing. The mailbox post, which had never caused a stir before, now had a sticker slapped on it. Violation. Immediate correction required. I laughed nervously at the absurdity, but deep down a knot of worry had formed. This was no longer about aesthetics or minor infractions. It was about control. They were testing me, seeing if I would bend or break under their petty tyranny. Days later, another notice arrived. This time, a fine that nearly doubled my monthly HOA dues. The letter made sure to emphasize the urgency. Failure to comply will result in legal action and additional penalties. I stared at the words, incredulous. Legal action? For a fence? For paint? The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. But I didn't react immediately. I needed a plan. I needed leverage. That night, I scrolled through the HOA documents online, hidden in some obscure corner of their website. That's when I found it. The loophole, the tiny clause buried in pages of regulations. It granted me oversight powers that the board didn't even realize I possessed. My pulse quickened. This was no longer a fight I would lose. The same people trying to intimidate me had no idea of my reach, my authority. The next week, I watched as the petty harassment continued, each action fueling my determination. The chairwoman sent another notice, demanding I remove a tree branch that had grown beyond approved height, even though it was clearly on my property line. Then I noticed a pattern. Their mistakes were consistent, predictable, almost mechanical. I began documenting everything, taking photos, recording dates, and noting inconsistencies in their enforcement. The more meticulous I became, the more I realized they had overstepped in ways they didn't anticipate. It wasn't long before whispers started circulating through the neighborhood. Some residents sympathized, subtly hinting that the HOA had a history of targeting anyone who challenged them. Others avoided me, wary of the ongoing drama. I felt isolated yet strangely empowered. The unfair rules, the constant scrutiny, and the ridiculous fines were no longer just annoyances. They were fuel for what I knew would become a reckoning. Then came the breaking point. A notice appeared on my front door, official-looking, warning that police intervention was imminent if I didn't comply with an arbitrary demand. My jaw tightened. This was absurd. But as I read the letter again, a plan began to form. They thought I was powerless. They didn't know I had connections, authority, and insight that could turn every threat back on them. Every morning became a calculated dance. I received emails, letters, and calls, each one more dramatic than the last. Every attempt to intimidate me was met with silence on my part until I was ready. I began preparing documentation, gathering evidence, and quietly contacting allies in the HOA network who could corroborate my position. Each day the tension mounted. Each petty violation, each aggressive notice, only tightened the coil of suspense in my mind. One evening, as I walked my property line, I noticed the chairwoman glaring from across the street, clipboard in hand, as if waiting for me to falter. I paused, meeting her stare with calm defiance. For a moment, the air was electric, the neighborhood holding its breath along with me. This confrontation wasn't just about paint or fences anymore. It was about pride, control, and the absurd power dynamics that had plagued this community for too long. And then, the cliffhanger that would change everything. I received a call from the HOA's legal counsel, their tone unusually nervous. "We need to discuss your recent findings." Immediately, my pulse raced. For the first time, they sounded unsure, maybe even afraid. The tide was shifting, and I could feel it. The next move would either cement their dominance or expose the absurdity of their petty tyranny to everyone. The day of the HOA hearing arrived, but it wasn't in a quiet office or a sterile meeting room. It was at the community clubhouse, under the fluorescent glare of the ceiling lights, with the entire neighborhood watching. I walked in, documents in hand, each page a testament to the absurdity and illegality of the fines and accusations they had piled on me. The chairwoman, clipboard clutched tightly as if it were a weapon, looked up at me with a sneer. The other board members shuffled papers nervously, and I realized almost immediately that my meticulous preparation had caught them off guard. They began their usual litany, the unauthorized. Paint color, the fence height, violation, the tree branch overgrowth, and the series of fines that had multiplied in recent weeks. Each accusation was meant to intimidate, to make me flinch. But I didn't. I held up my evidence calmly, letting the room absorb it. The signed approvals from previous HOA meetings, the photos proving no changes had been made, the time-stamped videos showing the exact measurements of my fence and landscaping. The room went quiet, and for the first time, the chairwoman's confident demeanor faltered. Then came the final, most outrageous accusation, that I had somehow trespassed on HOA-managed property without permission, a claim so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't being used to justify escalating fines and even a police threat. I held back my anger, speaking with measured precision. I reminded the board that every action I had taken was fully within my rights and documented meticulously. Each claim they made, each supposed violation, was not only baseless, but a blatant abuse of power. I saw murmurs ripple through the gathered neighbors. Faces that had previously avoided me were now leaning in, curious, some nodding in quiet agreement. I felt a surge of vindication. The tide was turning. The chairwoman tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand and continued, my voice steady but charged with controlled fury. You've spent weeks harassing me over rules that even your own documentation proves do not exist. And yet here I stand, calm, patient, and fully prepared. If this is the level of oversight and fairness this HOA promises, the neighborhood deserves to know the truth. I laid out the legal clause I had discovered, the one granting me oversight authority that superseded petty board enforcement in certain cases. Their eyes widened as I explained the implications. Any continued harassment or baseless fines could not only be challenged, but would legally expose the HOA board members to liability. The room's tension shifted palpably. The once confident antagonists now struggled to maintain composure. Then came the crescendo moment. I revealed a list of other violations the board had ignored over the years, issues that affected the entire neighborhood, from unsafe landscaping to unaddressed safety hazards. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The board had spent weeks targeting me over trivialities while allowing serious problems to persist elsewhere. I could see frustration flicker across their faces, the weight of their hypocrisy hitting them in real time. The chairwoman attempted one last power move, signaling for a vote to impose an immediate punitive fine. I calmly presented my evidence, and one by one, members of the community who had been watching quietly began questioning her authority. Is this really the best way to enforce the rules? One neighbor asked, voice steady. Another added, are these fines fair, or are they personal? The questions stung like arrows. The room was no longer on the board's side. The air was electric as I delivered the final blow. I publicly disclosed my connections across the national HOA oversight network, the authority I held that extended beyond this one community. The implication was clear. Any further attempts to intimidate or harass me could result in serious consequences, not just for the chairwoman, but for the entire board. Faces went pale. Whispers rippled through the audience, a mix of shock, disbelief, and dawning respect. For the first time, I saw fear. The chairwoman, who had spent weeks wielding power like a scepter, now stumbled over her words, her confident posture crumbling. The other board members avoided my gaze, shifting nervously as the crowd leaned in to witness the unraveling of authority they had blindly trusted. The neighborhood, which had seemed divided and wary, began murmuring agreement, support, even admiration, and just when it seemed victory was inevitable, she tried one last, desperate tactic. She called security, claiming a breach of decorum, attempting to physically intimidate me. But I was prepared. The moment was documented on video by several neighbors who had begun filming, and their cameras captured her overreach perfectly. The tension skyrocketed. Gasps echoed in the room as she realized her authority had evaporated, replaced by exposure. I remained calm, letting the silence stretch as all eyes shifted to the proof in my hands. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the documents on the table, ensuring everyone could see the chronological evidence of her harassment. The room absorbed it like a wave crashing over the shore. The weight of undeniable truth left the chairwoman speechless. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into minutes, she slumped back into her chair. Her attempts at control had failed utterly. Neighbors whispered, nodding subtly in solidarity, some even approaching to express quiet relief that someone had finally stood up to her tyranny. Even in that moment of triumph, I knew the story wasn't over. The board would regroup, strategize, and perhaps attempt another maneuver. But I had shifted the balance irreversibly. The absurdity, the bullying, and the petty harassment had been laid bare for everyone to see. The power dynamics had changed, and everyone understood that petty tyranny would no longer be tolerated. As I reached the edge of the parking lot, a final envelope appeared on my windshield. My heart skipped, expecting another petty violation. But this one was different. It wasn't a threat. It was a letter acknowledging the dismissal of all fines, the cessation of harassment, and perhaps most importantly, the recognition of my authority within the community. A small smile tugged at my lips. I had won, but the lingering question remained. Would the board ever truly accept that their power had been broken, or would this victory only invite a new, even stranger battle? The morning after the climactic confrontation, I woke to a different world. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud had dissipated, leaving a calm that almost felt surreal. Walks down the street, once marked by suspicious glances and wary avoidance, were now greeted with quiet nods of acknowledgement. People who had previously avoided eye contact now smiled, offering small gestures of support. It wasn't overt celebration, this wasn't a parade, but it was the subtle, unmistakable shift that comes when long-standing injustice is finally confronted. The HOA board, now humbled and visibly shaken, began to retreat from their prior position of unchallenged authority. Some members quietly resigned, citing personal reasons, while others begrudgingly adjusted their approach to community oversight. The chairwoman, whose arrogance had once dominated every board meeting, now avoided direct confrontation entirely. She no longer wielded petty fines like a weapon. Instead, she spoke in measured tones, often pausing to verify facts before issuing a directive. The contrast was stark, and the neighborhood noticed immediately. Word spread quickly among residents about what had happened. Several neighbors who had been quietly frustrated but unwilling to challenge the HOA now approached me privately, expressing gratitude. "We've been afraid to speak up for years," one resident said, her voice trembling. "You showed us that it's possible to stand up without losing everything." Another admitted he had secretly filmed some of the petty notices and fines in preparation for a potential escalation, and he was relieved they had finally been put to use effectively. The sense of solidarity in the neighborhood began to grow, a subtle but powerful movement toward fairness and accountability. With the immediate threats behind me, I turned attention to the longer-term consequences. The fines that had been unjustly levied were formally rescinded, and official documentation was sent to all affected homeowners. Letters clarified that no further punitive measures would be tolerated against me, and that the HOA was obligated to review its procedures to prevent future abuse. The process required some patience, legal follow-ups, and strategic correspondence. But each step was a reminder that persistence and meticulous preparation are often the most effective weapons against bureaucratic overreach. In the following weeks, small but meaningful changes began to ripple through the community. The HOA board, chastened by public exposure and scrutiny, implemented clearer guidelines for enforcement. They introduced a transparent appeal process, ensuring that any accusations of rule violations could be reviewed by an independent panel rather than an arbitrary board member. The absurdity and pettiness that had characterized the previous months slowly gave way to a more structured, predictable, and fair system. It wasn't perfect, but it was a dramatic improvement over the prior culture of fear and intimidation. On a personal level, the experience left me changed. The constant stress, anxiety, and frustration had taken a toll, but it also strengthened my resolve. I discovered resilience I hadn't fully recognized before, a capacity for strategic thinking under pressure, and an understanding of the importance of documenting every interaction. These lessons weren't just about HOA conflicts, they were about asserting boundaries, protecting one's rights, and refusing to let arbitrary authority dictate one's life. Interestingly, some of the neighbors who had observed the conflict from the sidelines began taking proactive steps themselves. I noticed a few attending board meetings, asking questions, and even volunteering to review compliance procedures. It was as if the events had ignited a collective awareness, the realization that the community belonged to everyone, not just the few who claimed authority over trivialities. The culture shifted slowly but perceptibly, from fear and avoidance to engagement and accountability. Even the chairwoman's eventual attempts to regain authority were met with scrutiny. She tried subtle maneuvers, suggesting minor policy changes or issuing new warnings, but the neighborhood had collectively raised its standards. The scrutiny that had been lacking before now acted as a natural check on her behavior. Any attempt to overreach was immediately questioned, often publicly, and the tone of enforcement became far more collaborative than coercive. In essence, the events had redefined the power dynamics in the community, and everyone understood that petty tyranny would no longer be tolerated. The sense of victory was not just about me. It was about demonstrating the power of preparedness, courage, and calm persistence. I had faced weeks of harassment, threats, and absurd fines, but the careful accumulation of evidence and the strategic presentation of authority had shifted the narrative. What had seemed like an insurmountable challenge was dismantled piece by piece, demonstrating that even bureaucratic overreach can be countered with patience, precision, and perseverance. There were, of course, lingering tensions. A few board members remained resentful, and certain neighbors who had sided with the HOA in the past kept their distance. But the majority of the community recognized the fairness of